Well, good morning. Thanks for joining me and us again this morning on this great book written by C.S. Lewis entitled The Great Divorce. As I have mentioned before, I think this is one of his very best books. I think it's a book that ought to be read in light of one's spirituality, one's discipleship, one's spiritual growth, spiritual formation. I think that in addition to that, in the way in which Lewis addresses culture and the world, that it's probably one of the most important books that we could be reading today, as well as the Screwtape Letters. I think that those are just like really important texts right now, given the ideology and worldview that seems to be that is not seems to be that is prevalent within the world in which we live. Uh, so we are on chapter one. We did the preface a couple of weeks ago. I tried to do this yesterday, and I had some technical issues with YouTube. So I wanted to, try and redo it again. Not only redo this again, but my understanding when I tried to do this 2 weeks ago that there was freezing up a lot, and so it has to do with our cable, which is we live out in the country. The service just isn't as good out here as other places, and so that's our struggle sometimes. So always feel free to remark in the comment section if you can, if something's happening, so that I know and I can maybe make some adjustments or whatever. If you can't hear me, if you can't understand me, or whatever, so that would be really helpful. So here we go again with chapter one and maybe chapter two. And in these chapters, recall that Lewis has created a fictional world where people have an opportunity to leave the outer perimeters of hell and to be bussed up into the outer perimeters of heaven, and given the opportunity to choose again whether or not they want to remain in hell or go to heaven. Now, you would think that that choice would be pretty simple, right? That if we were given the choice, what would we choose to do? But Lewis, who is not only a master at classical literature and his grasp on history and I think theology, is also a master at understanding the psychology of people. And so in this particular book, you really get into a lot of the psychologizing elements of why people do what they do and how they remain fixed according to do what how they do what they do, regardless of the damage that it might cause them. And so, in this particular chapter, we are going to encounter, I believe, four characters later on, two characters later on, and they are polar opposites of each other. So you'll see what I mean when we get to those two characters. Uh, there's um, a lot of what word do I want to use here? There's a lot of subtleties and subtle humor in how Lewis writes these chapters. And so it can be very helpful, and I'll try and point some of that out to you. Obviously, there's a little bit of a culture component here. In other words, our culture is not exactly like the Great Britain's culture, and there's a history, so there's a difference of 60, 70 years. So there are some things that he may say or do in his culture that we may not be quite as familiar with, and so I'll try and point that out and help us to understand it as well. So I'm just going to read it, and then as I come across what I think is a particularly important point, I will stop and make some comments, and you are always free to make some comments too. If you cannot make a comment, it's probably because you're not signed into YouTube as an account holder, and so you might need to set up your own YouTube account in order to be able to do that. So, okay. So this is the main character who, like in the Screwtape Letters, remains unnamed. And so this is where it begins. He says, I seem to be standing in a busy queue. That's a collection, a platform where people collect to get in line, to get on a bus or a tram or something like that. I seem to be standing in a busy queue by the side of a long, mean street. Evening was just closing in, and it was raining. I had been wandering for hours in similar mean streets, always in the rain and always in evening twilight. Time seemed to have paused on that dismal moment when only a few shops have lit up, and it was not yet dark enough for their windows to look cheering. And just as the evening never advanced to night, so my walking had never brought me to the better parts of town. Now, this is an important theme. So the evening never yet advances into the night, the full darkness. It's the outer perimeter. The eschatology of hell has not yet been fulfilled. So and so when we get deeper into the book, we will find that when they end up in heaven, that it's just barely dawn. It's not daylight. It hasn't yet advanced into daylight. So in hell, it has not yet advanced into night. In heaven, it has not yet advanced into the full day. And that's significant. That's very important in the overall kind of telos or end of the book itself. So he goes on to say, however far I went, I found only dingy lodging houses, small tobacconists, hoardings from which posters hung in rags, windowless warehouses, goods stations without trains, and bookshops of the sort that sell the works of Aristotle. So here's a stab at some subtle humor. Again, I don't know that Lewis would be adamantly opposed to everything that is about Aristotle, but um, he pokes at Aristotle, who was one of the great three philosophers: Socrates, Aristotle. Aristotle was known for his rationalism, his empiricism, so that for him, reality could only be measured by the senses. It could only be known by the senses. And so during the Crusades, the Crusaders sacked a lot of Muslim, Islamic cities, and they would find things. And some of those things they would bring back to Rome. And one of the things that the Crusaders found in one of the great cities of Islam was the works of Aristotle. So Aristotle had disappeared from history from his time up until I want to say around 1000, maybe 1100 AD. And so the Crusaders brought back the works of Aristotle, and so that was right around the time during the rise of the university in Europe. So that's when the university system was kind of invented, around 1000 to 1200 AD, somewhere around there, maybe closer to 1200 AD. And so they began to read the works of Aristotle. That heavily influenced a guy named Thomas Aquinas, who was one of the great medieval philosophers in Europe, and who offered some fairly good apologetics using Aristotle to defend the faith. Later on, Aristotle began to influence people like René Descartes, and was undergirded the rise of the Enlightenment, which began around the 16th century. The rise of the Enlightenment, which led to science and technology, and a whole host of other things can all be found, having a lot of its rootedness in the works of Aristotle. So the Enlightenment, in many respects, was not very friendly to the Christian faith, and gave many false promises that it could never deliver on. And so this is what Lewis is getting at. He's getting at the empiricism that that was rooted in the works of Aristotle, with his rationalism and his empiricism. So that's why Lewis includes this in this part. And so Lewis is taking a poke at that because, and here's the thing, and this is kind of a rabbit trail, but you need to understand this. Reason and logic are only as good as the variables that you have before you. So if we are trying to warn somebody about the weather, for example, and we say, because it's hot and it's cloudy, and it hasn't rained for a while, based on those variables, I can tell you that it's going to rain today. Well, those are three of any number of variables that you need to really get to an accurate forecast. So, if it hasn't rained, is it more likely that it will rain? Yes. If there are clouds, is it more likely that it will rain? Yes. Does heat oftentimes have something to say about whether or not it will rain? Right. The buildup of humidity and things like that. Yes. But does it mean necessarily that it will rain? No. You can have those three conditions all the time for a month long and never have any rain. You need additional variables. So Lewis was always a critic of that kind of a thing. That not only do people not include mistakenly because they don't know of these additional variables to use reason to arrive at a conclusion, but sometimes they selectively ignore variables. And social scientists do this all the time. I have a social science degree, so it's interesting what social scientists can do with surveys and with studies because of how they can manipulate the variables. So, and this is the kind of thing that Lewis was getting at. I wanted to take some time to spend on that because I think that it speaks to our time about how people selectively choose certain variables and ignore other variables as they arrive at what they consider to be rational conclusions about reality. And so it's not really reality because their conclusion was not thoroughly rational because it did not include all of the necessary variables to get you to what was really real and truly true. So I hope that makes sense. Feel free to send me a message if you need me to explain that more. But that's why Lewis includes Aristotle. I never met anyone, but for the little crowd at the bus stop. The whole town seemed to be empty. I think that's why I attached myself to the queue. Stroke of luck right away, for just as I took my stand, a little waspish woman who would have been ahead of me snapped out at a man who seemed to be with her. Very well, then, I won't go at all. So there, and left the queue. Pray, don't imagine, said the man in a very dignified voice, that I care about going in the least. I have only been trying to please you for peace sake. My own feelings are, of course, a matter of no importance. I quite understand that. And suiting the action to the word, he also walked away. So what we're going to see here are a variety of reasons why people pass up this opportunity to go to heaven over very shallow and stupid reasons. So this is the beginning of that. Come, thought I, that's 2 places gained in line. Was now next to a very short man with a scowl, who glanced at me with an expression of extreme disfavor and observed rather loudly to the man beyond him, "This sort of thing really makes one think twice about going at all." So he didn't like the company. That he thought, well, I'm not going to go. "What sort of thing?" growled the other big, beefy person. "Well," said the short man, "really the sort of society I'm used to. As a matter of fact—" "Oh," said the big man, and then added with a glance at me, "Don't you stand any sauce from him, mister. You're not afraid of him, are you?" Then, seeing I made no move, he rounded suddenly on the short man and said, "Not good enough for you, we like your lip." Next moment he had fetched the short man one on the side of the face and sent him sprawling into the gutter. "Let him lay, let him lay," said the big man to no one in particular. "I'm a plain man, that's what I am. I got to have my rights, same as anyone else, see?" As the short man showed no disposition to rejoin the queue and soon began limping away, I closed up rather cautiously behind the big man and congratulated myself on having gained yet another step. And so here we have, right, we have a man and a woman who, are bickering with each other and trying to please each other, and they can't, so they get out of line. They pass up they pass up heaven in order to go to remain in hell. And then there's this big man who is offended easily. I mean, actually, nobody said anything to him, and he reacted and belted this younger, shorter man this smaller, shorter man who was clearly arrogant, and felt that he was better than everybody else, and so he belted the shorter guy, knocked him into the gutter, and this guy, the bigger man, talks about his rights and how he has to get what belongs to him, and so we have all of these kinds of people in our society, don't we? And those things impact how we live our lives. 2 young people in front of him also left us arm in arm. They were both so trousered, slender, giggly, and false that I could be sure of the sex of neither, but it was clear that each, for the moment, preferred the other to the of a place in the bus. And so this is a line that you could read today and think that he was talking about many people that you would encounter today out at the mall or in a city or at a concert or whatever. So these, neutral people who, you just can't tell what gender they are. "We shall never get in," said a female voice with a whine in it from some 4 places ahead of me. "Change places with you for 5 bob, lady," said someone else. I heard the clink of money and then a scream from a female voice mixed with roars of laughter from the rest of the crowd. The cheated woman leaped out of her place to fly at the man who had bilked her, but the others immediately closed up and flung her out. So what with one thing and the other, the queue had reduced itself to manageable proportions long before the bus appeared. So there was this gradual erosion of people in line for rather shallow reasons. It was a wonderful vehicle, blazing with golden light, heroically colored. The driver, in capitals, himself seemed full of light and used only one hand to drive with. The other he waved before his face as if to fan away the greasy steam of the rain. A growl went up from the queue as he came in, as he came in sight. So whether this is an angelic figure or the Holy Spirit or whatever, I don't know, but clearly this is a divine figure, capitalized. So it would imply a divine figure that Lewis is fictionally including into this encounter with people on the queue. Looks as if he had a good time of it, eh? Bloody pleased with himself, I bet. My dear, why can't he behave naturally? Thinks himself too good to look at us. Who does he imagine he is? All that gilding and purple, I call it a wicked waste. Why don't they spend some of the money on their house property down here? God, I'd like to give him one in the old ear. I could see nothing in the countenance of the driver to justify all this, unless it were that he had a look of authority and seemed intent on carrying out his job. My fellow passengers fought like hens to get on board. The bus, though there was plenty of room for all, I was the last to get in. The bus was only half full, and I selected a seat in the back, well away from the others. And so now we're going to come up to two characters that he meets, both ideologically on opposite sides of the spectrum. So this is the first one. But a tousled-haired youth at once came and sat down beside me. As we did so, he moved off. I thought you wouldn't mind my tacking on to you, he said, for I've noticed that you feel just as I do about the present company. Why on earth they insist on coming, I can't imagine. They won't like it at all when they get there, and they'd really be much more comfortable. It's different for you and me. Do they like this place? I asked. As much as they like anything, he answered. They've got some fish and chips shops and advertisements and all the sort of things they want. The appalling lack of any intellectual life doesn't. I realized as soon as I got here that there'd been some mistake. I ought to have taken the first bus, fooled around trying to wake people up here. I found a few fellows and tried to form a little circle, but they all seemed to have sunk to the level of their surroundings. Even before we came here, I had some doubts about a man like Cyril Blolo. Now, Cyril Blolo was a literary figure in Lewis's time in the 1940s. He was kind of iconic, and he would have been iconic or symbolic of all literary people in that time, journalists, poets, people like that. And so in the same way that the media, journalism, poetry, those kinds of things, novelists were all kind of like-minded in their worldview and their ideology. So Cyril Blolo was representative of that. And so this young man said he was having doubts about that kind of a guy and those kinds of people in the culture, in the same way that you and I might have doubts about the journalists, the novelists, and people like that in our kind of culture today. I always thought he was working a false idiom, so principle of sorts. But he was at least intelligent. One could get some criticism worth hearing from him, even if he was a failure on the creative side. But now he seems to have nothing left but his own self-conceit. The last time I tried to read him some of my own stuff, talk about conceit, but wait a minute, I'd just like you to look at it. Realizing with a shudder that what he was producing from his pocket was a thick wad of typewritten paper, I muttered something about not having my spectacles and exclaimed, "Hello, we've left the ground." So here's this young tassel-haired poet who wanted, who was concerned about the self-conceit of Cyril Blolo, and offended that Blolo wouldn't read his stuff, and now he wanted to push this stuff off on the main character here. So around, and he says, it was true, several hundred feet below us, already half hidden in the rain and mist, the wet roofs of the town appeared, spreading without break as far as the eye could reach. So this is another really important theme in this book because Lewis wants to give you this sense of the vast expanse of this hell, this portion on the outer perimeter of hell. And it seems to be, this whole town seems to be infinite. It seems to be that vast, that huge, that enormous. And so the higher they get up, the more and more they still cannot see the end of this town. It is that huge. All right. This is important because later on, Lewis is going to make this comparison between the enormity of hell and then the vast expansion. And the comparison and contrast that he makes there is beyond stunning. It's just one of the most helpful things. So, for example, for many people in our world today, they tend to see God and Satan, heaven and hell as almost co-equals. Maybe God a little more powerful, hell or heaven a little more prominent. Push come to shove, God's going to win, heaven's going to prevail. So there's this almost yin yang thing, this between heaven and hell, with in their mind heaven being slightly more significant, slightly more powerful. There isn't anything that could be further from that. Heaven itself is that its power and its significance uh, is is beyond comprehension, and that even as Lewis paints the vastness of hell here, that it is less than insignificant in comparison. So you'll see this later on in the book, deeper into the book. It's a phenomenal description. So I'm going to go ahead and go into chapter 2 and maybe just to get us started so that you where we're headed with this. Chapter 3 is wonderful. It's one of my most favorite chapters I've ever read in any book, as a matter of fact. So he goes on, I was not left very long at the mercy of the tousle-headed poet, because another passenger interrupted our conversation. But before that happened, I had learned a good deal about him. He appeared to be a singularly ill-used man. His parents had never appreciated him, and none of the 5 schools at which he had been educated seemed to have made any provision for a talent and temperament such as his. To make matters worse, he had been exactly the sort of boy in whose case the examination system works out maximum unfairness and absurdity. So this is so much of the conversation in higher education today, and you saw it back then. What was it? 60, 75 years later. Here we are. And so you have these students who demand that the institution change for them because the institution is unfair. They want the institution to meet their standards. They should not be obliged to meet the standards of the institution. So then he goes on to say, it was not until he reached the university that he began to recognize that all these injustices did not come by chance, but were the inevitable results of our economic system. Sound familiar? Capitalism did not merely enslave the workers, it also vitiated. So the word vitiated, the word vitiated means to impair, spoil, to debase, or to make useless. Capitalism did not merely enslave the workers, it also impaired them, it spoiled them, it debased them, it made them useless, and vulgarized intellect. Hence our educational system, and hence the lack of recognition for this poet, for new genius. This discovery had made him a communist. But when the war came along, he saw Russia in alliance with Russia, the former Soviet Union, which was communist. He saw Russia in alliance with the capitalist governments. He had found himself once more isolated, and it had to become a conscientious objector, so he would not go to war. The indignities he suffered at this stage of his career had, he confessed, embittered him. He decided he could serve the cause best by going to America. But then America came into the war too. It was at this point that he suddenly saw Sweden as the home of a really new and radical art. But the various oppressors had given him no facilities for going to Sweden. So he was in Great Britain. He didn't like that. He went to the United States. He didn't like that. He wanted to go to Sweden, but he couldn't get enough money because of the oppressors. They wouldn't either give him the money or allow him to get the money. There were money troubles. His father, who had never progressed beyond the most atrocious complacency and smugness of the Victorian epoch, was giving him a ludicrously inaccurate, a really civilized and adult personality, and unexpectedly revealed that she was a mass of bourgeoisie prejudices and monogamic instincts. So, matrimony, motherhood, instincts. Jealousy, possessiveness was a quality he particularly disliked. She had even shown herself in the end to be mean about money. That was the last straw. He joined. I gave a start, but he took no notice. Even then he continued. Ill luck had continued to dog him. He had been sent to Greytown, but of course it was a mistake. I would find, he assured me, that all the other passengers would be with me on the return journey. He would not. So we get this hint then that people leave Greytown, this outer perimeter of hell. They go to heaven. They don't like what they see or experience, and they come back. He's saying there are going to be people who come back, and you're probably going to be one of them, he says. He was going to stay there. He felt quite certain that he was going where at last his finely critical spirit would no longer be outraged by an uncongenial environment, and he would find, quote, recognition and appreciation. Meanwhile, since I hadn't got my glasses, he would read me the passage about Cyril Blellow, and so insensitive. It was just then that we were interrupted. One of the quarrels, which was simmering on the bus, had boiled over, and for a moment there was a stampede. Knives were drawn, pistols were fired, but strangely innocuous. And when it was over, I found myself unharmed, though in a different seat. Who is the opposite of the first person? He was an intelligent-looking man with a rather bulbous nose and a bowler hat. I looked out the windows. We were now so high that all below us had become featureless, but fields, rivers, or mountains I did not see. And I got the impression that the Greytown still filled the whole field of vision. It seems like a deuce of a town, I volunteered, and that's what I can't understand. The parts of it that I saw were so empty. Was there a much larger population? Not at all, said my neighbor. The trouble is that they are so quarrelsome, as we have discovered so far. As soon as anyone arrives, he settles in some street. Before he's been there 24 hours, he quarrels with his neighbor. Before the week is over, he has quarreled so badly that he decides to move on. Very likely he finds the next street empty because all the people have quarreled with their neighbors and moved. So if so, he settles in. If by any chance the street is full, he goes further. But even if he stays, it makes no odds. He's sure to have another quarrel pretty soon, and then he'll move on again. Finally, he'll move right out to the edge of the town and build a new house. You see, it's easy here. You've only got to think a house, and there it is. And so, so a couple of things that Lewis is intimating here is that nobody in hell gets along with anybody else. Everybody is only about their own interests and not the interests of others. And that the people who live there live in their own kind of fantasy. So there is this thing that's a kind of a gray town, but people can, in their own mind, in their own denial, in their own fantasy, create um, a, a a world that is less than, significantly less than any ideal that they could know or fathom or think of here in this world. So whatever house they want to create there, it's a house, but it's corrupted because hell and their nature, their condition, their mind will not allow them to create a perfect house. And so this is probably, and this is a rabbit trail too, but this is probably to a certain degree Hellenism, that is Greek philosophy, particularly Plato. This is probably Plato's influence on Lewis to a certain degree, and Plato believed in a thing called the world of the forms. So in heaven, there were these forms, and anything that you could think of on earth existed there, but it existed in its in its perfect form. Anything on earth was modeled after the perfect form in heaven. So, because we can't really create perfect things on earth because of our fallen nature, um, there's a sense in which if that thing were to exist in heaven, it would be perfect because heaven is perfect and because God is perfect. So, what Lewis is doing here in hell, because hell is so corrupt and uh, so corrosive, anything they create in hell is just it's just it's just hardly anything at all, because what they are in hell will not allow them to make anything in their mind more than what it is, more than what their person can make. So it's a bit of a rabbit trail, but I'm just saying that I think that Plato's influence on Lewis as he creates this fictional town in hell is what's going on here. So Lewis would not die on this hill that the hell is exactly like this. He's creating the kind of hell so that you can understand the kind of people better that may end up in hell. So that's what's driving this. So anyway, he goes on to say, that's how the town keeps growing, leaving more and more empty streets. That's right. And time's sort of odd here. That place where we caught the bus is thousands of miles from the Civic Center, where all the newcomers arrive from Earth. All the people you've met are living near the bus stop, but they've taken centuries of our time to get there by gradual removals. And what about the earlier arrivals? I mean, there must be people who came from Earth to your town even longer ago. That's right, there are. They've been moving on, going further apart, so they're far off by now and could never think of coming to the bus stop at all. Astronomical distances. There's a bit of rising ground near where I live, and a chap has a telescope. You can see the lights of the inhabited houses where those old ones live, millions of miles away. So this is the expanse of the town, he's saying. Millions of miles away, millions of miles from us and from one another. Every now and then they move further still. That's one of the disappointments. I thought you'd meet interesting historical figures, but you don't. They're too far away. Would they get to the bus stop in time if they ever set out? Well, theoretically, but it'd be a distance of light years. Now remember, light travels 1,760,000 feet per second. And so if you take all the seconds in a year, and times 1,760,000 miles, that's 1 light year. So he's saying that the expanse of this town, Greytown, that some people live a distance of light years away from the bus stop. That's how huge it is. And maybe that's how many people who live there. This is all very important. When we get deeper into the book and we talk about the significance and the substantiality of heaven, into the significance and the substantiality of hell. It's really, really important idea here. That is brilliant in terms of how Lewis describes it. So he goes on to say, well, theoretically, but it would be of light years, and they wouldn't want to by now. Not those old chaps like Tamburlaine, Genghis Khan, or Julius Caesar, or Fifth. So Lewis is assuming that all of these people are already in hell, and since they're older, they've moved further out to being light years away from the civic center. So wouldn't want to? That's right. The nearest of those old ones is Napoleon. We know that because two chaps made the journey to see him. They started long ago before I came, of course, but I was there and then they came back. This is a little bit of the humor with Lewis, too, because Great Britain and France under Napoleon were arch enemies. Napoleon, the emperor, who tried to conquer the whole of the European continent, he was defeated at Waterloo. And so, Lewis writes Napoleon into here just to, to shore up that narrative between Great Britain and France. It is kind of. So that's right. The nearest of those old ones is Napoleon. You know that because two chaps made the journey to see him. They started long before I came, of course, but I was there when about 15,000 years of our time it took them to travel to Napoleon and come back. We've picked out the houses by now, just a little pinprick of and nothing else near it for millions of miles. So Napoleon has no neighbors. He's that irascible. He's that difficult. He's that uncomfortable to be around. And so they said they picked out his house from millions of miles away. And of course, this is all fictional, but he's making a point here. But they got there. That's right. He built himself a huge house, all in empire style. Rows of windows, flaming with light, that only shows as a pinprick from where I live. Did they see Napoleon? That's right. They went up and looked through one of the windows. Napoleon was there all right. What was he doing? Walking up and down all the time, left, right, never stopping for a moment. The two chaps watched him for about a year, and he never rested, and muttering to himself all the time, it was Soult's fault. It was Ney's fault. It was Josephine's fault. It was the fault of the Russians. It was the fault of the English. And so here they're painting this iconic historical figure, Napoleon, who never got over his loss at Waterloo and his loss of his aspirations for an empire on the European continent. And so he blames everybody else selfishly. He refuses to take responsibility for not only his loss, but why he's in hell. And so there are a lot of people who never take responsibility, who are in hell for themselves and blame other people. It's always someone else's fault. It's never anyone else's fault. And so that's what Lewis is trying to say here. From the vibrations, I gathered that the bus was still moving, but there was now nothing to be seen from the windows which confirmed this, nothing but gray void above and below. So you get this sense of not only the town being expansive, light years in diameter, but also this ongoing distance from the surface of Greytown to how they rise and go further and further and further and further and further and further up. And there seems to be a vast expanse there as well. Then the town will go on spreading indefinitely, I said. That's right, said the intelligent man, unless someone can do something about it. How do you mean? Well, as a matter of fact, between you and me and the wall, that's my job at the moment. What's the trouble about this place that is Greytown? Not that people are quarrelsome. That's only human nature, and was always the same even on Earth. The trouble is they have no needs. He he capitalizes the word needs as if our needs have a divine component to them, as if they are our gods. So I think that's why he does that. The trouble is they have no needs, capital N. We have no needs that are our idols. You get everything you want, not very good quality, of course, by just imagining it. That's why it never costs any trouble to move to another street or build another house. In other words, there's no proper economic basis for any community life. If they needed real shops, chaps would have to stay near where the real shops are. If they needed real houses, they'd have to stay near where builders are. It's scarcity that enables the society to exist. And so here now, Lewis is offering this guy who's somewhat of a hyper capitalist and a toxic capitalist. And for him, the solution to anyone's problem in the world is simply to give them this, is to be able to provide them the stuff that they say they want, so they can buy it and then have it and meet their needs. Well, that's where I come in. I'm not going on this trip for my health, as far as that goes. I don't think it would suit me up there. But if I could come back with some real commodities, anything at all, that you could really bite or drink or sit on, why, at once you get a demand down here in our town. I'd start a little business. I'd have something to sell. You'd sooner get people coming to live near centralization. So here he's saying he's going to go to heaven, find some stuff that people in hell might want, and bring it back and sell it to them. And that would solve the problems, or many of the problems in Greytown. You will see as we go on later on why this proposal of his is an utter impossibility. Why uh, it would be ludicrous to try and get anything from heaven into hell. He goes on to say, two fully inhabited would accommodate the people that are now spread over 1,000,000 square miles of empty streets. I'd make a nice little profit and be a public benefactor as well. You mean if they had to live together, they gradually learn to quarrel less? Seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? Well, I don't know about that. I dare say they could be kept a bit quieter. You'd have a chance to build up a police force, knock some kind of discipline into them. Anyway, and here he dropped his voice, it'd be better, you know. Everyone admits that safety in numbers. Safety from what? I began. But my companion nudged me to be silent. I changed the question. But look here, said I. If they can get everything just by imagining it, why would they want any real things, as you call them? Oh, oh well, they'd like houses that really kept out the rain. So these people live in hell and with their fantasy can try and construct anything they want, but the misery of hell itself penetrates those fantasies. Those fantasies cannot hold out any of the miserable aspects of hell itself. Their present houses don't? Well, of course not. How could they? What the devil is use of building them then? The intelligent man put his head closer to mine. Safety again, he muttered. At least the feeling of safety. It's all right now, but later on, you understand. So, do you remember how I said that it was dusk but never fully dark in hell, and then when we get into heaven, it'll be dawn, but never fully daylight. He is alluding here to the dark in hell. So that's why he's saying it's all right now, but later on you'll understand. What, said I, almost involuntarily sinking my own voice to a whisper. He articulated noiselessly, as if expecting that I understood, lip reading. I put my ear close to his mouth. Speak up, I said. It will be dark presently, he mouthed. You mean the evening is really going to turn into night in the end? He nodded. What's that got to do with it, said I. Well, no one wants to be outdoors when that happens. Why? His reply was so furtive that I had to ask him several times to repeat it. When he had done so, being a little annoyed, as one is so often is with whisperers, I replied without remembering to lower my voice. Who are they? I asked. What are you afraid they'll do to you? And why should they come out when it's dark? And what protection could an imaginary house give if there were any danger? Here, shouted the big man. Who's talking all that stuff? You stop your whispering, you two. If you don't want a hiding, see, spread rumors, that's what I call it. You shut your face. So here you get this sense of impending calamity, of judgment, that the full measure of hell has not yet been visited on these people who are in Greytown because they are on the outer perimeter. So there's an eschatology here, right? And so this intelligent man is talking about how something soon is going to happen, and when they build their houses in their minds, they feel safe even though they aren't safe, and even though they don't like each other, he's saying that there are some who might think that being collected in higher numbers, they might make them feel safe about this impending doom that's going to happen. So they go on to say, quite right, scandalous, ought to be prosecuted. How did they get on the bus? Growled the passengers. A fat, clean-shaven man who sat in the front of me leaned back and addressed me in a cultured voice. Excuse me, he said, but I couldn't help overhearing part of your conversation. So here we have a third guy. It's astonishing how these primitive superstitions linger on. I beg your pardon. Oh, God bless my soul. That's all it is. There's not a shred of evidence that this twilight is ever going to turn into night. So here is a guy who is a cynic. He's an unbeliever. He doesn't believe that there's ever going to be some kind of final judgment, right? There has been a revolution of opinion on that in educated circles. I'm surprised that you haven't heard of it all. All the nightmare fantasies of our ancestors being swept away. What we now see is this subdued and delicate half-light is the promise of the dawn, the slow turning of a whole nation towards the light. So he sees the dusk becoming a dawn. And so he sees the exact opposite. So when does dusk ever become dawn? When does dawn ever become dusk? You never have a dawn without this impending sense that the sun is rising. You never have a dusk without this impending sense that the night is coming. He's saying it's the opposite of that, this man with the well-cultured voice. What we now see is this subdued, delicate half-light is the promise of the dawn, the slow turning of a whole nation towards the light. Slow and imperceptible, of course, and not through eastern windows only. When daylight comes in the light. When daylight comes in the light. And that passion for, quote, real commodities, which our friend speaks of, is only materialism, you know. It's retrogressive, earthbound, a hankering for matter. But we look upon this spiritual city, for with all of its faults, it is spiritual, as a nursery in which the creative functions of man, now freed from the clogs of matter, begin to try their wings, a sublime thought. So this guy's in his otherworldly, uh, reality, and has turned everything upside down in terms of what is really real and truly true. Hours later, hours later, there came a change. It began to grow light in the bus. So now we begin to see. So the conversation stopped, and this third man is stopped speaking, and now we're going to see this gradual entry into the perimeters of heaven. Hours later, there came a change. It began to grow light in the bus. The grayness outside the windows turned from mud color to mother of pearl, then to faintest blue, then to a bright blueness that stung the eyes. We seemed to be floating in a pure vacancy. There were no lands, no sun, no stars in sight, only the radiant abyss. I let down the window beside me. Delicious fresh air came in for a second, and then "What the hell are you doing?" shouted the intelligent man, leaning roughly across me and pulling up the window sharply. "Want all of us to catch death of a cold?" "Hit him a biff," said the big man. I glanced round the bus. Though the windows were closed and soon muffed, the bus was full of light. It was a cruel light. It shrank from the faces and forms by which I was surrounded. They were all fixed faces, full not of possibilities, but impossibilities. So these people seem to be hopeless. Some gaunt, some bloated, with some glaring with idiotic ferocity, some drowned beyond recovery in dreams, but all, in one way or another, distorted and faded. One had a feeling that they might fall to pieces at any moment if the light grew much stronger. Then there was a mirror at the end of the bus. I caught sight of my own, and still grew the light. So I'm going to end here, and we will get into chapter 3, which is, as I said, one of my most favorite chapters of any book I've ever read. But you get this sense, then, don't you, of the different kinds of characters and their the primary sin in each of them that landed them in hell. And we'll have more to say about those primary sins and what they do to people. But hopefully, this has whetted your appetite, and you will be able to get deeper. Please feel free to share this. I will always try to set up each chapter so that those who join us late might be able to enter into the discussion of the chapter more easily. But it would be great to be able to share this and have more and more people be a part of this. So thank you for joining us, Sandy and Ruth and Melissa. And I think we have another fourth person. I don't know who that is. And there are always people who come on and watch it later. But it's great to have you, and I really appreciate it. So God bless and take care.